Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this RSK webinar entitled How to Comprehensively Scope Solar PV NSIPs. Now, I'm not sure who slipped in the word comprehensively there, but we'll try and be as comprehensive as we possibly can. So this webinar is part of RSK Group's Power On webinar series, which aims to discuss key barriers and opportunities during the energy development project lifecycle in order to power forward the global energy transition. Now, solar projects are relatively new to the NSIP world. I think the first solar DCO that was made was in 2020. And so everyone involved is really on a rapid learning curve, to be honest. And as a group in RSK, we're currently working on 11 solar DCOs currently lodged with PINs, and they're in various shapes and sizes, and we're providing EIA planning and stakeholder comm services across those. And we're also currently working on 8 other solar DCOs not currently in the public domain. So we've got a fair bit of experience in the solar DCO world, and hopefully that will continue. So in terms of scoping at RSK, I encourage our team to scope proportionately, bravely, and be more confident in their own professional judgment and opinion. We've a tried and tested EIA scoping report template in place, and we also hold what we call scoping challenge workshops throughout the scoping process with each of our discipline teams to effectively challenge what they're proposing to scope in and what they're proposing to scope out. However, the braver you are and the more risks you take, the greater the chances are of receiving kickback to your approach from the consultees. And to be fair, that's generally what we are seeing. So how it's going to work today is that there will be a panel discussion, but folks, there's no such thing as a free lunch, okay? Before we start the discussion, there will be a Slido question before we kick off. So get your fingers ready because we need your help. Okay, so just in terms of housekeeping, all attendees' microphones are automatically muted throughout the webinar. During the presentation, you can post questions online, and there will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. As many questions as possible will be answered, and those that can't be answered due to time constraints, if you run out of time, will be answered after the webinar. Shortly after the webinar, you'll receive a link to a short survey, and if you could take a few minutes to provide some feedback, that would be greatly appreciated. So, as I said, it's a panel discussion, folks, and I'm joined by my colleagues, Richard and Mike. So, Richard, can I hand over to you to introduce yourself, please?
Hi, Dave. Thanks very much for the invite. Yeah, as it says on the slide, I am a partner at BDB Pitmans in the infrastructure planning team, and our team focuses almost entirely on promoting NSIP projects, and I have a particular focus on promoting renewables projects and a further focus on promoting solar DCOs. As a team, we're advising on more than 10 solar DCO projects at present, including working with Dave and Mike. As part of the DCO process, we advise on all legal aspects of the application to submission, and then beyond that, obviously advise on examination through to a successful consent. So looking forward today to talking about scoping and how we can hopefully pragmatically and comprehensively undertake EIA scoping.
Thanks, Richard. And Mike, you introduce yourself, please.
Thanks, Dave. Afternoon, everyone. I'm Mike Breslow. So yeah, I'm the lead DCO manager in the RWE solar and storage team. Town planner by background, so very much not an EIA practitioner, but I've been involved in NSIPs for probably 8 or 9 years now. RWE have currently got 3 solar projects live with PINs and hopefully a couple more to follow soon. So yeah, I'll give a bit of a developer's experience today, but an upbeat one, hopefully. Yeah, looking forward to it.
Thanks, Mike. And last and very much least in this esteemed company is myself. I'm David Hoare, Technical Director at RSK Environment. RSK are an environmental consultancy, and certainly for solar DCOs, we provide all the services in-house through planning, stakeholder comms, all the environmental disciplines, etc. Our grounding is in energy, and particularly renewables. We were formed in 1989, and since then energy has been a massive focus of our work and will continue to be in the future. We don't just deal with DCOs, we also do a load of TCPA work as well. And as I said, we're currently involved in 11 solar DCOs currently lodged with PINs, and we're also working on another 8. So, Richard, can I hand over to you to explain what on earth scoping is for those who on the call that may not know?
Thanks, Dave. So yeah, we won't assume a particular level of knowledge on this topic. Clearly, a lot of you watching will be EIA practitioners. So I just thought to give a brief intro to the legal requirements and also a bit of info on the advice that the Planning Inspectorate provides. So if you could move on to the first legal slide. So as I've said there, assume that EIA is required. So when you come to promote a DCO, you either screen it to check whether it does constitute EIA development, or you tell the Secretary of State that you think it is EIA development and you will be submitting an environmental statement. Regulation 10 then goes on to deal with the legal requirements for scoping. Now, scoping an EIA isn't a requirement, but it provides an opportunity to ask the Secretary of State or the Planning Inspectorate, who undertakes the process, to give their view in writing as to the scope of the EIA, level of detail to be provided. Now, the legal requirements are relatively little in terms of what must be submitted. So the very basics are a plan to identify where your solar project is going to go, a description of the development, which includes both location and technical capacity and megawattage capacity, and also importantly, an explanation of the likely significant environmental effects of the development. So that's it in terms of the legal requirements, but then Advice Note 7 from the Planning Inspectorate includes a bit more information as what they think should be submitted to help consultees understand the project and to enable PINs to decide what should be in and what should be out. And that includes further plans, details of alternatives for the particular development, including in relation to location, a scoping out summary table, and also further detail on particular topics or matters that should be scoped out. And then importantly, any evidence that you've reached as a promoter with particular consultees on particular areas of the EIA. So the Secretary of State, once he's got your scoping report, then has to consult with various statutory bodies and may also consult with other non-statutory bodies. Those bodies then have 28 days to submit their responses on the report, and the Secretary of State has a total of 42 days to from the date of receipt of the request to then issue the opinion. And Regulation 4.3 requires that the ES, so the final submitted ES, must be based on the most recently adopted scoping opinion. That doesn't mean it has to be exactly the same, and it doesn't mean that you can't then engage with relevant bodies to scope out further stuff once you've received your opinion. Okay, next slide, please. So I mentioned PIN's advice, advice note number 7, which is now a new shiny format on PIN's infrastructure website, but is largely the same information. I think it was most recently updated 4 years ago. Now, PINS recommends that non-statutory consultation for your project is undertaken before scoping, or at least isn't undertaken at the same time as scoping. And the purpose there is to avoid any confusion on the part of consultees in relation to those two exercises, and I think also to allow them time to assimilate both the scoping report, but also the information included in the non-stats con. Now, promoters take different approaches, and we'll come on to that in further detail, but that's clearly a bit of a bone of contention, and different promoters take different approaches. Another point it makes in the advice note is which is one I certainly agree with, is making sure there's sufficient detail, certainty on design and design elements before you undertake scoping, essentially to make the most of the scoping process, and so that the consultees have got sufficient information to decide whether something should be scoped in or out. And I've also mentioned there that PINS is pretty keen on promoting that any sort of plan you submit and the description of development shouldn't be sort of include various options within the main site alternatives, but acknowledges that some elements of optionality is fine, and for solar that could be a number of grid connection routes, but what PINS doesn't like is a great swathe of land within which a grid corridor could be included, but by the point of scoping certainly recommends that the grid connection routes are narrowed down to a few different corridors. And then finally, this is a point we can come on to in greater detail, but the advice note actually specifies that PINS is keen to ensure that the scoping process is used effectively, ensuring that the EI process is proportionate. Now, clearly, in order to get to a proportionate EIA, some level of detail needs to be put into the scoping reports, and it might be argued that would require a disproportionate amount of work in order to scope things out. So that's just a point that we can touch on in further detail. And then one final slide, which I suppose emphasizes the point I just made. The justification for scoping items out is included at paragraph 511 of the advice note, and that essentially sets out a range of questions that the promoter should go to in order to provide justification for scoping out, and I won't go through them in any great detail, but clearly demonstrating that there's a pathway between the proposed development and the relevant matter, that receptor is sensitive, and then I think the important things to point out are mitigation. The scoping requires a relatively decent level of mitigation in order for the consultees to decide whether it should be scoped out, and importantly, it's useful for PINS to demonstrate whether any agreement at that point has been reached with the relevant consultee. Now, at that point, it might be with the LPA in terms of viewpoints or ecological or cultural heritage, but by that point, it's normally quite difficult to get engagement with the likes of EA and Natural England. But again, we can come on to talk about what might be happening in terms of that consultee engagement and proportionate cost recovery. So that's probably it for background, Dave. So now let's crack on with the meat of the webinar.
Thanks, Richard. Right, folks, this is where you come in. We have a Slido question. If you can move on to the next slide, please. So if you can wiggle your phone or whatever over the QR code, or there's the website to type in, and there's a little code there. And we'd like you to answer this question, please. What are your main challenges to scoping solar PV NSIPs? Now, I believe there's a character limit of 25 characters, so you can't be typing, chapter and verse here. And also, everything that you type in will be shown on screen, all anonymously. So we'll leave that on for a couple of minutes, and if you can start typing, that'd be great. Here's the first one coming in, lads. Here's the timing. Okay, I think we can probably say a lot about timing, can't we? I think. Or they come in thick and fast now. Scoping out topics, yeah. Okay. This is all resonating with us, I think. I should just say as well, you know, obviously we're focusing on solar PV NSIPs here, but, you know, probably a lot of what we're going to talk about is applicable to any project really that requires scoping. So, you know, hopefully it'll be a useful discussion. So we got design optionality, level of detail, yeah. That all resonates, I think. Okay, approach to consultancy, yeah. So I'm presuming you mean perhaps differing approaches to how consultants treat scoping, etc., in terms of scoping out, scoping in, etc. Land rights, okay, yeah. Okay, all right. Well, I think that's, oh, hang on, three more people are typing. Okay, we'll just give it another 30 seconds. Design freeze, yeah, okay. Pins confidence, yep, okay. Should have a countdown clock, shouldn't I, behind me, perhaps. And something else just came in. Okay, alternative considerations, yeah, that's great. Okay, well, brilliant stuff. Okay, we'll leave it. Oh, just got one more. Go on then. Go on, one more. Thank you very much for all this input. It's fantastic. Okay, all right, right, okay, we'll leave it there. So, gents, I think all those resonate with us. I think what we'll do, folks, is that we'll probably pick 3 or 4 of those and we'll talk about them in more detail. So obviously, you know, you've got me from sort of the consultancy side of things, you've got Richard from the legal side, and you've also got Mike from the applicant developer, and Mike is a planner by trade as well. So you've got all three lots in one in Michael. Okay, so hopefully we'll all be able to give different perspectives. So lads, if we perhaps choose, timing was the first one. So why don't we talk about timing first? So obviously the title of this webinar is how to comprehensively scope solar PV NSIPs. So perhaps if we can all have a quick chat about, you know, what the challenges are in relation to timing and how you would recommend those challenges trying to be overcome. Richard.
Yeah, so I suppose I've already talked about, to an extent, what PINS promotes and recommends in terms of timing. So within the guidance document AN7, PINS recommends that non-stat consultation is undertaken before scoping, which in an ideal world, I think we'd all like to follow that approach, and certainly not in an ideal world we'd want the process to be long, but that certainly does allow consultees' views to be taken into account, and that includes the LPA and other consultees' views to be taken into account before you actually scope. And also, I think because solar projects, and to an extent all other NSIP projects, can be locally controversial, it's also nice to sort of socialise a project and introduce it to the local population in a softer setting, I suppose, rather than shoving a very technical document into the public domain in the guise of the scoping report and opinion. So yeah, I mean that's currently the recommended approach by PINS, and I don't see that deviating in any way, shape, or form. But when we start on these projects, there can be differing views within the project team, and it's obviously guided by the promoter, by the client, and what their views are, where costs are, where project costs are, how cash flow is. So I suppose at this point it'd be quite useful to
seamless.
understand Mike's.
Yeah, why don't we hand over to Mike on that point?
Yeah, no, I'm nodding along a lot there, Richard. I think, yeah, it's one of those. It's the first key milestone, I suppose. So yeah, the sooner you've got it in, then you've got your opinion. You're thinking about where the stakeholders are at. You're already thinking ahead to your peer. So I think as developers, I'm pushing Dave and others to say, yeah, let's crack on and do it. But yeah, so where and when do we do it? You know, ideally you've got all of your land secured. You've done your work in the background to know where you are on capacity and project description and where your issues are. So I think we tend to be looking to kick them off sort of 3 months post start, and by start I mean, yeah, getting the likes of yourselves involved. You can write scope and reports a lot quicker than that, especially if you've got all the information. But yeah, we're heading, Richard, towards a kind of softer landing. So we have done scoping first, but I think on the current projects and moving forward, we're going to take that sort of non-stat followed by scoping or in parallel. You know, I think there is some benefit there. Some of the materials and the things you're thinking about for non-stat, be it zonal master plans or anything indicative or softer, you might want to think about putting some of those elements in your scoping report, and then, you know, some of that narrative and illustrative stuff can possibly help. But it's a balance. You know, there's logistics and a couple of extra weeks and months in doing non-stat, so I think I can understand why yeah, some people are keen to just push the scoping report out there, but we're more moving towards the consultation and the softer stuff first. And in terms of pins, I don't think there is any confusion from my perspective. I mean, personally, I've never had LPAs or Natural England fill out non-stat feedback forms or respond to a non-stat consultation. Parish councils, you know, will usually brief them. We'll include something about scoping in the non-stat to say, here's the project, here's a bit of info. In a couple of weeks, the scoping is going to follow. And if they are minded to respond to non-stat, they'll usually just cut and paste that and put that in the scope and response anyway, in my experience. So yeah, it's a bit of a balance. Both ways work from my perspective.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I think for me, you know, for those of you who know me on the call, and there may be some, I've always said the timing of scoping is key. And quite often, as you correctly point out, Mike, we're often asked as consultants to commence preparation of the scoping report quite early on in the programme. We get it, you know, because it's seen as probably one of the first documents that will be publicly available, and it gets the process moving. However, you know, from our perspective, scoping early can mean we don't have all the information we would ideally have on the proposed development itself, nor on the environmental baseline, to try and, you know, promote this proportionate approach and be brave, take risks, as I referred to before. So for me, I think it's all about talking to your client and running them through the pros and cons of timing. And also, I think it's important to note that delaying scoping, for want of a better term, by X number of months doesn't necessarily mean that you need to extend the pre-application program by the same number of months. Because if you can get more information either on your scheme or on the baseline, that can help or should help you scope out more factors and elements, albeit recognizing that scoping is not all within our gift as a consultant or a project team. So providing more time for scoping can help you justify a reduced scope of the assessment, which means there'll hopefully be less work for the peer and the ES, and hopefully any time that you take in terms of delaying the submission of scoping, you can claw back after scoping, because, you know, hopefully you'll have agreed a reduced scope of work. So that would be my view, but yeah, it is a challenge, you know. So
I think
okay.
one thing that Mike alluded to is the engagement by bodies and you know, not necessarily a willingness to respond to non-stat con, but definitely a willingness to respond to scoping. And it may be that you know, we're not all perfect, and certain things may come out of the opinion that you hadn't thought of, and therefore getting that early view on things then sort of starts you off on dealing with particular issues as early as possible, rather than having to wait until after non-statcom.
Yeah.
I think it might also be, clearly promoters want to minimise costs as far as possible and minimise the duration of pre-application. But there are some promoters who have got grid connections way into the future and aren't necessarily in a rush. So there are lots of different ways to skin the cat.
There are.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Well, I think design maturity was something else that popped up on the Slido poll. Mike, I'll come to you first on that one.
Yeah, cheers, Dave. Yeah, again, it's one of those. It's the theme really, balancing the flexibility with the information, with the cost, with the time spent. So you want a proportionate assessment. You need the project description to be robust, and we've found and you do need the evidence. I think that's on Richard's slide really. So we've got a good body of evidence. We've got a great project description. Now, you look at any of the developers out there, you can provide infrastructure information, parameters, photos, broadly defined solar areas, even substations in some instances, constructability. It's there's only so many things you can put on a solar site. There's only so many ways you can build and operate them. I think, they all look very similar now. So there's a good body in there. I guess what we don't have is typically things like, we won't have invested in traffic counts. We don't know for certain if we need to move a public right of way. We can't give them detailed quantities of volumes of waste material. We haven't typically done ground investigations. We don't know exactly where we're going to directional drill under. I could go on some of those. Sometimes we do, or we've got a good feeling, but we want to retain the flexibility. So in all of those instances, where we haven't had that, I think it would have helped us. But again, we're just back to that balance. So I think my advice there is just try and make sure that project description is robust and you're confident in what you've got there. And if you haven't got all of the information, work with the consultants to make some assumptions and keep a bit of flexibility.
Yeah, definitely, Mike. Yeah, I think from a consultant's perspective, quite often getting a decent project description to assess is one of our biggest challenges as a consultant, to be perfectly honest. So for me, it's working with your client and the design team to understand the level of detail that can be provided at scoping, whilst recognizing that the need to retain flexibility and not nailing your colours to the mast too early on. So things like, borrow pits, the BESS, the substations, the cable corridors, the grid connections, etc. It's just trying to get as much detail as possible on that, whilst recognizing that, the design will evolve and it's only at a certain stage at scoping. So, for example, one of our recent solar DCOs that we obtained a scoping opinion for, we proposed to scope out certain ecological receptors on the basis that buffers would be retained from around the edges of the fields. However, that level of detail wasn't shown on the layout plan that was submitted in support of the scoping report, and therefore the scoping opinion essentially kicked back. So one of the lessons learned is the zonal master plan that you submit with your scoping report should reflect any reference buffers and offsets to provide evidence and justification to support the embedded mitigation and design controls detailed within your scoping report. Also, I think that it would be useful to provide layout options instead of just having a plan showing the entire site as solar. So it's just thinking about things a little bit in more detail that will hopefully help you be more proportionate in your scope and provide justifications for scoping matters out. Things like, if you refer to horizontal directional drilling, which obviously most solar projects do, if there's water courses, etc., that need to be crossed by access tracks. Again, it's providing as much detail as possible on that HDD process, and ideally appending something like a drilling fluid breakout plan, which has been commonly asked for in the scoping opinions that we've received. Also, I think just saying that there's a commitment to provide habitat mitigation and compensation isn't sufficient to scope habitats out. We need to provide as much detail as possible, making it perfectly clear that any infrastructure won't be located within flood zones 2 or 3. you know, and perhaps if indeed that's possible, particularly in relations to the substations and BESS, you know, ram that message home and try and convey that on a plan. You mentioned public rights of way, Mike, you know, where possible, can we commit to no diversions or stopping up? It may not be possible, but again, that level of detail and assurance certainly helps us as consultants in trying to scope things out. And also, it's about communicating the level of detail we as consultants would ideally need for scoping to, you know, our clients and the design teams, and why that level of detail is important to give us the best chance of proposing a proportionate scope to the assessment. Because generally, in our experience over the last 12, 18 months, a lack of detail on the design is often one of the main reasons used for kickback regarding scoping certain factors or matters out. So, Richard, what about from the legal side?
Yeah, and I suppose there's also the importance of building up that level of maturity, so you can then, you know, figure out how different elements interact.
Yeah.
Again, certain things may come out the wash, and then you suddenly realise post scoping that you actually need additional land for X, Y, and Z,
Yeah.
and then the potential for that to impact on consultation and the need to reconsult. So again, the more you flush things, you know, the whole purpose of the DCO process is to be front loaded and think of issues early, and the NSIP action plan and the fast track, again, there's even more emphasis on that early engagement and design maturity, engagement with consultees. So clearly, the more you can do, the better. But you know, Dave's alluded to some of the issues with certainly expenditure on items that can be, you know, quite considerable early doors. In terms of engagement with consultees, I think it's useful, hopefully useful, to see where we're heading in terms of consultee cost recovery and the potential for engagement with, if your consultants are on board, they've identified particular issues with the development where early consultation is required, then this principle of cost recovery should allow a more engaged process early on, even before scoping. That's probably all I need to say on that one.
Yeah. So I think moving on, I think one of the next ones that came up on the slide though was like the extent of baseline information. So from a consultant's perspective, I think that's, you know, the other main thing that results in kickback. So we talked about the level of detail in the design, and the second biggest thing is not necessarily in that order, but the second thing is the extent of baseline information you have at the time of scoping. It all goes back to the timing point that we discussed at the start. So, but sometimes I think consultants do themselves a little bit of a disservice, and some of the feedback that we've got in some of our scoping opinions recently is that they've requested survey reports to be appended to the scoping report, say like the ALC, so Agricultural Land Classification Survey report, or the GeoPhys survey report, or the ecology survey reports, and we have all them, but sometimes we don't append them. So, you know, that's been a learning curve for us, because, you know, PINs and the consultees want to see that sort of background detail. One of our recent ones, we undertook a preliminary ecological appraisal of the main solar array site, but understandably we weren't able to undertake that survey along the grid connection corridor because it hadn't been defined. And so we proposed to scope out certain ecological receptors across the board on the basis of the findings of that PEA survey of the main solar array site. But we got kickback on everything because we hadn't undertaken the PEA of the grid connection corridor. Okay, so again, it just so happened that that just couldn't happen for that particular project at that particular time. But again, one of our learning curves is that ideally we undertake a preliminary ecological appraisal of the entire site, including the grid corridor, and include that report or append it to the scoping report. And in terms of cultural heritage specifically, we've started undertaking a stage 1 settings assessment and appending that to the scoping report. because that's a bit of feedback that we got from our first solar DCO scope and opinion that we received. And within that, we consider things like dust and noise. That's become a big thing, and has been cited in a couple of other scope and opinions that we've received for solar DCOs. Include a zone of theoretical visibility purely for heritage assets, not just for landscape assets, and showing the location of those on a plan, because that's some of the feedback that we've got. And obviously, you can understand that because a picture tends to paint 1,000 words. And also evidence how assets do not derive their significance from their views. Okay, so it's not enough just to say, oh, this particular grade 2 listed building doesn't derive any significance from its view. Quite often you will have gone to visit that particular asset and determined that yourself. However, you don't specifically say that. So again, it's going back to, don't do ourselves a disservice as consultants. Be perfectly clear how you are forming your views on the proposed scope that you're outlining. Richard, anything from a legal perspective from you?
I think engagement with the RPA is a useful one. Normally, the RPA or certain officers within the RPA are willing to engage, and if not, you could promote a plan of performance agreement to make sure you've got that early engagement and understanding of the baseline, whether it's in relation to ecology or archaeology or whatever, and also potentially making use of other baseline information in the public domain, whether that's in relation to nearby solar schemes or other developments. And I think also using the body of information that's now on the PINS website in terms of those projects that have gone before, and looking for patterns in scoping opinions, seeing what has been scoped out, what's been scoped in, based on what level of baseline information.
Thanks, Richard. And Mike, from a developer's perspective?
Yeah, quickly, we probably have had reports in the past, Dave, that might have been useful to include in scoping, but I guess, yes, some of the intricacies or difficulties might be that it will include land that was originally in and is now out. And, sometimes you're doing surveys and work as the project's still evolving. So then you're having to sort of rejig and totally rewrite and change those reports. PEA along cable corridors obviously rings a bell, and yeah, we've been there as well. And I think would love to do it. Again, we're back to the balance. The sort of developer view is, if I've got 6 cable corridors at 800 acres, we're definitely not going to survey that at that time. So yeah, it's just back to the balance. That's probably it on baseline. I mean, the only other thing I ever see from PINS is sort of, a request that all data is accurate and up to date. That seems to be just a given. But yeah.
Actually, Dave, a related point. I think one of the responses on Slido was land rights.
Yeah.
So it's definitely worth, in relation to electricity generation stations, whether solar or otherwise, to consider applying for a electricity generation license. And that sort of gives you the bite in order to seek access under the Housing and Planning Act, Section 172. So that can potentially free up those issues where you're failing to gain access for surveys, whether that's before or after scoping.
Yeah. And if anyone wants to find more about that, folks, then we have the correct person here. Okay, so so just moving on to probably our last point that we'll discuss. Again, that this came up on the slide, and we've already touched on it a little bit, is approach to consultation, varying advice, risk averseness. Richard, I'll hand over to you first.
Yeah, I mean, what I just mentioned in terms of PIN's approach. Obviously, you mentioned, Dave, the first DCO was Cleve Hill, but we're now at a position where we've got plenty of scoping opinions on the PIN's website. So we're seeing what tends to be scoped out. So the likes of glint and glare, utilities, human health, EMF, major accidents and disasters, some elements of water, but then also seeing that it's more tricky to get certain things scoped out, like decommissioning waste, flood risk, etc. So if you wanted to scope those things out, then you'd clearly have to do a lot more in terms of engagement with the EA and the IDB and flood authorities,
which takes time.
Exactly, and money.
Yep. Mike, you've RWE received 3 scoping opinions on current projects. What are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, there is. Yeah, it's varied, and PIN's confidence was that was in there as well. Yeah, as a developer, look, you're always looking to scope out, or you're always looking to ensure it's proportionate. We've been successful in the sort of areas that Richard says, in your dust, your health, your major accidents, and as you know, we've tried to be a bit bolder on others, ground conditions, flood, materials, because we have seen occasions where it's been scoped out. We've typically had pushback. I need to be careful. I'm not an EIA developer, and I appreciate PINs need to be very balanced and certain. And again, it probably is, if we were to reflect back to that evidence point, that if we'd done a bit more. But there are times when I think sort of seeking to scope something out, to me, doesn't necessarily mean you're not assessing it, or you're not considering it, or flood has got an FRA and an outline drainage plan.
How my feeling about flood risk, Michael.
We've had this. I'd like to know from if there's an ES out there for a solar farm that's found significant adverse effects on flooding, I'd be and that's progressed. I'd be interested to see.
As you alluded to, it's not that we're saying that we're going to completely ignore flood risk. Any DCO application needs to be supported by a flood risk assessment. It's part of the Section 55 checklist, and I don't think I've ever worked on a project, let alone a DCO, that will end up having a significant effect on flood risk, or having flood risk having a potentially significant effect on the development. So, that's one that continues to perhaps baffle me, shall I say.
Yeah.
But then again, where the argument against it is that the Environment Agency will expect it.
Yeah.
And, so, that's what we have to, engage with them on.
Yeah.
Really.
It's not always PINs. Yeah, as you say, they're kind of influenced by those other consultee responses as well. And
yeah, that's it. Yeah. So I think from my perspective, we've had 3 scoping opinions back recently for solar DCOs. Obviously, those 3 solar DCOs are in different parts of the country, different shapes and sizes, etc., different issues. But we pretty much proposed the same scope, give or take a few issues that were specific to those specific sites, but the varying advice and opinion that we got was quite stark, and you sort of think, well, there can't be that much difference, and so it's something that we're working on, and making sure that we provide that justification in terms of all the baseline information that we can, and the level of maturity of the design, and also there's often where we've received kickback because of our brave and proportionate approach. It's often come with a caveat, unless you can provide evidence of agreement to your approach with your relevant consultee. So again, that goes back to the importance of speaking to these consultees, ideally before you submit scoping, so they're not just hit cold with what you're proposing, especially if you're a consultancy like us who try and be brave and scope proportionally, or we consider to be proportionate, and take risks and be more confident in our own convictions. And so it is all about engagement, I think, and it does show the importance of being able to consult effectively. So, folks, I think we've sort of run out of time to discuss anything in major detail now, but be mindful that we do need to open the floor to any questions. I'm going to ask you, gents, if there was one golden rule or one piece of advice you could convey to our lovely audience today in terms of solar PV NSIPs and scoping, what would it be? Mike, I'll come to you first.
Make sure you've got a good lawyer and consultant. No, I'm only half joking on that.
Other consultants and lawyers not available, by the way, folks. Yeah.
Of course. I mean, yeah, you sort of touched on it at the start. If I was trying to answer the exam question of sort of comprehensively scoping, then I'd be saying review all of the reports and include everything PINS has asked for on previous projects. But I think, yeah, from the developer side, it's probably way up with your consultants and advisors, you know, where you think that time and if you need additional surveys or resources or workshops and cost, you know, talk that through with them. And then I'd squeeze in, don't be afraid to ask, you know, if you think you've got a case. And then something else we're trying to do is maybe use a scoping report to sell the benefits of the project a bit more. So like you said, Dave, signpost all of that mitigation and buffers and get it in there and give yourself the best chance.
A lot of it is about how you convey the information, to be honest. And as I said, sometimes, you know, we sometimes do ourselves a disservice. Richard, what's your golden nugget, please?
Yeah, I think try and accord with PIN's advice in terms of undertaking your non-stat consultation before scoping, if possible. But you know, there's nothing to stop you doing it afterwards, or even in tandem with. And during that non-stat consultation, or even earlier, engage with the local authority and get as much information from them as possible, whether that's in relation to their views on viewpoints or cumulatives or cultural heritage or baseline information. Because the more engagement you can do, the better. And I think supporting your view, Dave, on being brave, just because there has been some pushback and it can be frustrating at times. I don't think we should stop being brave.
Thanks, Richard. I think from me, it's on a similar theme. I think, you know, learn your lessons, but stick to your own professional judgment and opinion, and continue to fight the good fight for proportionality. And who knows, we may well get there. So, right, we'll go over to the questions, and I'll just have a look if there are any in the poll. Okay, yeah, we've got one here. Richard, I'll come to you on this first. What potential implications will the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act have on the potential, and the potential advent of environmental outcomes reports have on the scoping process?
Good question. So these environmental outcome reports have been proposed by the Levelling Up Regeneration Act to replace EIA, but at the moment all we've got is the Act, and we don't have the regulations that will come with it. I'm sure we won't have them before 4th of July. So there's some level of detail about what's proposed in terms of essentially simplifying the environmental impact process, making it outcomes focused. So we look at a specific environmental outcome. I think 8 are proposed at the moment.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's going to result in lawyers and EIA consultants being completely disposed of, but it will be a more streamlined and pragmatic process, and could potentially, if everything's to be believed in terms of the consultation, scoping could be completely dispensed with altogether.
Yeah,
but again, we won't know until the regulations come out. So query whether that's an ideal place to be in, because scoping does provide that formal process to understand what consultees are thinking on particular aspects.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure whether it's going to be completely left to the promoter to decide what to shove in and what to justify should be excluded, or whether as part of this sort of increased pre-application engagement, both with PINs and consultees, whether that will essentially replace the scoping process to guide the developer on where to go, rather than just deciding whether things should go in or out. So my personal view is scoping exercise is actually quite useful to flush things out and identify things you hadn't thought about. But until we see the regs, it raises more questions than answers.
Yeah, no, it's my understanding that, similar to yours, Richard, is that, there will be a set of outcomes and every project will need to appraise their project against those set of outcomes. You won't be able to say, oh, well, that doesn't apply or whatever, that'll be it. So, the scoping process as we know it essentially goes away, I suppose, but we will see. Folks, keep firing your questions in, please. There's quite a few coming through now. Obviously, we've only got about 6 minutes left, but please do continue to put them in the chat. Just on the theme of scoping, Richard, this is a legal question, so I'll come to you again if you don't mind. You mentioned scoping is not a legal requirement of the Planning Act, which is correct. It's not a legal requirement of the EIA regulations in any shape or form, town and country planning or otherwise. Would there ever be a benefit of proceeding without a scoping report or an opinion?
Well, I've just said that I find the scoping process quite useful, and it's a step. It's not technically part of consultation, but it is a consultation process with consultees. But if you're confident that you've built up an understanding of the project and the impacts, and you've undertaken your own non-statutory consultation, and you've used the body of evidence that exists on the PIN's website, then there's clearly no requirement. And I think from a promoter perspective, it could save you money and time. But I think it's a risk. It comes with a risk because you're not undertaking that informal engagement. And as Mike alluded to earlier, it's that formal engagement where consultees actually engage, rather than sort of dipping in and out, and you don't necessarily get the feedback that you expect or require. But yeah, on all my DCO projects, we've always scoped. I find it a useful exercise, and until EORs come into play, I shall continue to advise that approach.
And why not? Yeah, I mean, I must admit, from our perspective, I always advocate scoping for DCOs, TCPAs, whatever. As frustrating as the process can be sometimes, and that's probably why I'm a lot greyer than I should be at my tender age, then I'll certainly continue to champion the benefits of scoping for as long as that process remains. Mike, any comment from you, particularly from your sort of planning hat?
No, I mean, I guess we are sort of quite familiar with the process now, and whilst we still have grumbles, I think we have a template and a way of doing it. And I think, as Richard said, kind of using it to get some early engagement helps. And I think maybe with the chargeback that's coming in as well with some of the key consultations, you may get it a little bit more out of it. You'll either get, we're reaching out to you because we want to draft a scoping report, and they say, oh, we're too busy, we'll respond when we actually see the scoping report. But then other times you might get an office or a region where you do get a good bit of useful stuff early on, so might see that improve as well.
Yeah. Okay, I think we've got time for one more, and this is to both of you. Mike, if you want to go first. Any advice on agreeing PPAs with LPAs, i.e. the benefits of agreeing this at scoping stage?
Broadly agree it as soon as you can, I think, really is our view. So yeah, again, it's one of those first key documents we put out there, and we've had varying success with it. So we've got a project where a PPA has been out for over a year. You know, we finished 2 rounds of consultation. It's only just about to be signed. We've managed to keep engagement going through that process. So it really does depend, I think, on where you are in the country and how well resourced the authority is. They're not the sort of the silver bullet maybe that you think, well, if we've signed it, we'll get everything we need. But equally, if that authority is shy of a landscape officer and an ecologist, and you're happy to put some funds in and get that covered, then yes. But equally, we've got, you know, projects where we haven't had the ability to agree viewpoints or other things at the time we'd like, but we've done it further down the line. So yeah, push for it and do your best.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And quickly, Richard, from you.
Yeah, again, I'd always thoroughly recommend PPAs, even at the scoping stage, because it allows you to engage with the officers more meaningfully. Again, particularly on viewpoints, cumulatives, etc. LPA shouldn't see it as a blank check that said that the wording needs to be sort of suitably worded and constrained, and include things like hourly rates, etc. And timetables, and making sure there's performance on both sides. But yeah, I've always found them quite useful. I think it also depends on the level of understanding within the authority as well, whether that authority has hosted a DCO project before. But yeah, you know, LPA resources, as every promoter and consultant in the TCPA and DCO world knows, are limited. So PPAs can really help sort of bridge any funding gap.
Thanks, Richard. Brilliant. Well, thank you both for contributing to this. It's greatly appreciated, and thank you to all of you who've dialed in today. I hope you've enjoyed it, and thank you for submitting all those questions and the Slido poll, everything. Okay, so as I said before, this is the second of the webinars in our RSK Power On series. And if you want to find out more about the Power On series in general, there is a guide. This webinar has been recorded, so that the recording will be on that website. You can scan on the QR code. I'm too old to know how to do that, but I'm sure some of you, there's people younger than me on this that will understand all that. So if that, you can download the guide on that link and see any previous events and all our upcoming events, that because this series will continue for a good few months yet. Okay, so next slide, please. And obviously, if you want to get in touch with any of us, then there's our details. So it just remains for me to say thank you again. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you found it useful. And we hope to see, thanks very much for Richard and Mike again. It's you all for attending, and we hope to see you all again on our next Power On webinar. Thank you very much.